Hello from Learn TV channel. My name is Teuta and I will be your host. We are very excited to present a new topic and a new guest for you. We will talk about systematic thinking with Dr. Morné Mostert, who is an international advisor on strategic foresight and executive decision-making. Morné has experience with many assignments in Geneva, Paris, London, Rome, Melbourne, and in several African and Middle Eastern economic hubs. With a PhD in technology and innovation, Dr. Morné invented the Mindset Index. I believe we have him online with me right now. Good morning, Dr. Morné.
Hi, Teuta. Great to be with you.
Morné, let's start with the Mindset Index. What exactly is this phenomenon about?
The Mindset Index is a world-first scientific assessment of mindset for strategic decision-making. It's the result of over a decade of research. I think a useful way to think about it, Teuta, is 100 years ago, we were in fairly small, homogeneous communities. And in those communities, people really had very similar mindsets. In the last 60, 70 years, with globalization, large-scale, almost tectonic shifts, mindsets have really diversified. We can no longer, as strategists, assume everyone has the same mindset. Now, these insights on mindset are absolutely critical for strategic success. The mind is an amazing thing. Churchill, during war times, of course, famously said, the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. And now, for the first time, there's a scientific instrument that clarifies mindset for strategic decision-making in the form of this Mindset Index.
Can we point out the difference between strategic and systematic thinking?
Yes, and in fact, it's a minor but very significant difference. Perhaps one way to start is to understand that there are various ways in which we might think. We could think in strategic ways, in systematic ways. I'll talk about that in a moment. We could use futures thinking, creative thinking, design thinking, systems thinking, quite different from systematic thinking, and more recently, computational thinking. So the reality is that the mind, the intellect, can be used in various ways as we apply our minds to thinking. Now, what's the difference between so-called systematic and strategic thinking? Well, one way to think about it is that systematic thinking is often associated with analytical thinking. What does that mean? Essentially, it means that I'm confronted by a problem, and as an analyst, I break that problem into little pieces, little parts. And that I do with the belief that if I optimize each part, I will somehow optimize the whole. Now, that way of thinking is the default for most managers and leaders, and it's one of the differences why so many senior people have difficulty with strategic thinking. So what does strategic thinking add to that? One way to think about strategic thinking is to say, well, there's a kind of operational thinking that has to do with tasks and activities and processes. There's a tactical approach to thinking above that, which responds to the challenges of operations. And then strategic thinking sits on top of that. And essentially, Teuta, it has three main qualities. The first is that strategic thinking operates at a higher level. That is a higher level of intellectual functioning and higher level inside the organization. The second is that strategic thinking has a longer time horizon. So I'm thinking a little bit further into the future. And the third and very important dimension is that strategic thinking is context conscious. In other words, very importantly, it looks outside the boundaries of the organization at dimensions like the customer, the competitor, the supplier, and so on. And in this way, analytical thinking can be used as one of the inputs, but strategic thinking is really what gives the difference in competitiveness.
According to Paul Sarvadi, who wrote Take Care of Your People, culture is one area where we can clearly see the distinction between the strategic and systematic side and the symbiosis between them. Do you share his opinion?
I think he's right. I think when we think about culture, we have to understand that culture is really the expression of beliefs. It's the way in which we embody those beliefs. It includes the rituals that demonstrate what we believe. Now, as futurists, we pay very careful attention to the role of culture for strategy. And one way to do that Of course, as futurists, we're predominantly interested in the future, but we pay a deep respect to the past by looking at what we call a little O-patch model. O-patch is a little acronym, and it looks at origins, that is, where do we come from? Where does our product range come from? Our patterns, that's the P. The A is for attitudes, how we feel about things. T is for traditions. C for cultures. And H is for habits. These things that we do again and again and again. O-patch. So strategy has a deep respect for that O-patch insight. But in addition to that, strategy is also, as I mentioned, context conscious and forward-looking beyond those operations and tactics. So culture can be a great friend if it is respected through models like the O-patch, but it can also be a great enemy because essentially people express their belief system in cultural practices. And so if that culture is, of course, not aligned with strategic direction, you have this clash. And typically, culture wins.
And do you think that most professionals, managers and directors prefer adopting one way of thinking rather than both?
I think that's exactly right. We must remember that thinking is a behavior, and all behavior eventually settles into a pattern. And in fact, if you think about the concept of a paradigm, essentially it means a pattern of thinking. Now, most leaders develop, therefore, thinking habits. And, most people have sort of 5 to 7 questions that they take into most meetings with them, and they're essentially concerned with the part, and particularly the part that they think the meeting is not mentioning. Now, the default for most leaders, and this is important to understand, is in fact analysis. All of us have been trained on analytical thinking. This is useful for certain kinds of problems. It's not so effective in high complexity environments. And that's, again, I think, one of the dilemmas that many senior people face. They're trained very meticulously in analytical thinking. When they then get to more senior levels in the organization, it requires an alternative approach to thinking, including strategic and systems thinking. It's good, therefore, to identify your own mindset, your own thinking, so you can be conscious with self-insight and then move towards alternative ways to think.
And when is better to think strategically and when systematically?
I think that's a highly appropriate question because in reality, it is more appropriate to use analysis for certain kinds of problems. But perhaps one way to answer that question is to understand that one of the most dominant shifts in the business environment in the last 60 years is the exponential growth of complexity. Now, when you have a narrow set of parameters, kind of highly predictable problems, analytical thinking works very well. It thinks in terms of problems and solutions. But if you think about this complexity, analytical thinking runs into a bit of a problem. So let's think about what drives complexity. Well, let's just reflect on our own business environment. The first thing that drives complexity is the sheer number of elements in the system. So think about how many more competitors we may have or how many more customers we may have to serve. The second is the interaction between these parts in the system. So just imagine how customers and even competitors and suppliers, even investors, are now much more connected than they've ever been in history. The third is the phenomenon of rules. And I don't just mean explicit rules, but also tacit rules, implicit rules, rules under the surface. The fourth thing that drives complexity is choice. And of course, we know customers want choice. The more choice they have, the more complex the environment becomes. Number 5 is speed. We all expect the world now to operate at the speed of Google or Amazon. And then finally, the last one is a little bit difficult to define, comes from the world of exponential organizations. It's what's technically known as dematerialization. Essentially what it means is the kind of problems we work with today do not yield to the senses. They cannot be felt and seen and tasted and touched. Think about ideas like customer loyalty. Think about leadership. Think about motivation, inspiration, brand values. These are all essentially constructs, intellectual pieces that we work with to understand the world. Very different from the world of the 1780s with machinery and tools and nuts and bolts. So In response to that question around when is it more suitable to use a more strategic or even systemic way to think, when these complexity drivers are present, the number, the interaction between them, the tacit rules, wide range of choice, enormous hyperspeed, and dramatic dematerialization, then it is often less suitable to use traditional analytical thinking, much more useful to use systemic and strategic thinking.
And what is system thinking inside strategic thinking?
Gosh, yes, we can see this rich bouquet of different types of thinking, analytical thinking or systematic thinking, strategic thinking, systems thinking, and others. Increasingly, what we're seeing around the world in the world of strategic thinking is that they're supporting that with an approach to thinking known as systems thinking, which really respects this complexity that I mentioned in a very deep way. In the 1980s and 1990s, when we thought about strategy, the typical kind of method was, come up with a product and then segment your market. I think most business people would recognize geographical segmentation, psychographical segmentation, and so on. Classify the market into parts, classify your own organization into parts. Just think about the organogram, how that's a practical example of putting things into parts. So market into parts, organization into parts, run linear processes, give everyone a KPI, hope for the best. I think in a high complex driven environment, systems thinking offers a very interesting contribution to the world of our thinking. So instead of just thinking about the parts, and instead of just putting that into a slightly longer term plan, which we might call strategic planning, not a lot of strategic thinking going into that, systems thinking says this. It says all problems operate in systems. In fact, they operate in always more than one system. We can call those multiple containing systems. So what systems thinking does is it says, think of your problems as operating inside a broader ecosystem, which means that there are other players and problems and examples inside those systems. They are potentially connected or connectable. So systems thinking says, use the wisdom of the nature of behavior in living systems, identify new potential connections, and in that way, you'll redesign the system both internally and contextually. And that should make you strategically much more competitive.
Morné, is strategic and systematic thinking one of the top 5 competencies that top senior leaders should possess?
Tita, I would say so. Of course, we've all seen the lists from the World Economic Forum looking at competencies such as creative thinking, innovation, and so on. I think what we're discovering as we stand back from this is that the use of the intellectual domain for leaders is really moving to the fore. Some would say it's because, we really have to celebrate, in a sense, what it means to be human. And so we can't any longer behave like machines in classical analytical ways of thinking. So I would say certainly yes, we've all seen it in recruitment requirements, for example. Everybody wants a strategic thinker. What we've often seen is that very few companies, unfortunately, very few leaders really have a sense of what strategic thinking is, what it means, how they can use it. Of course, it's perfectly normal to understand. Very often, people are promoted through the organization because of their competence in analytical thinking and operational problem solving. So when they get to senior and top levels, they're now required to think strategically. That intellectual domain, to think contextually, longer term and at higher intellectual levels, I think is emerging as a critical competence for the 21st century.
In your opinion, Morné, should organizations invest in training their employees to be able to think strategically and systematically?
Tita, I would say it is absolutely imperative for strategic competitiveness for leaders to be able to think strategically. We should also have empathy with leaders. Where should they have learned this stuff in the first place? Of course, organizations don't invest in strategic thinking when you just enter at a junior level, but as you move through those ranks, the requirements change. The reality is that alternative, more advanced forms of what we call intellectual processing, problem solving, thinking abilities are required at more senior levels. The good news, of course, is that all of this can be learned. We've developed, just as an example, a step-by-step guide for each one of these distinct thinking methodologies: systematic thinking or analytical thinking, strategic thinking, systems thinking, creative thinking, design thinking, computational thinking. They each can be studied discreetly. They can be learned just like any other skill, and their advantages to the organization are significant.
Morné, we would like to wrap up asking you if you can share some examples for strategic and systematic thinking.
Yes, it's of course very conceptual to talk about the world of thinking. Perhaps I could use one example of a very famous pen company for which this is not an example, and this is in the public domain. But if you think about, let's say, the Mont Blanc company, you think about how do I innovate around that Mont Blanc pen. Now, if you use analytical thinking, what will typically happen is you'll take that pen and you'll try to understand the parts. You might even break it into parts so that you can understand each part separately, on the theory that if you improve each part, you will somehow improve the pen. But what did Mont Blanc do? Mont Blanc used systems thinking. They said, this pen sits inside a system. That system is the containing system of status. What else can we find in that system? Well, a whole host of other portable status icons, such as a wallet. And so what Mont Blanc did is they made those connections in the contextual system. They connected the white dot at the back of the pen with the wallet, and suddenly a $10 wallet is $300. That's an excellent example of how using systems thinking in support of strategic thinking advances creative thinking. You can see these thinking modalities all work together. So if you can support that with insights from a scientific instrument like the Mindset Index to understand world views, the potential for innovation is absolutely staggering. Toyota, we should say, when we look around the world today, with all the challenges organizations face, the reality is that innovation is no longer optional. It has become a matter of strategic survival.
Morné, thank you for the amazing insights that you shared today.
Toyota, thank you for bringing this important work to the decision makers that shape the future.
Dear viewers, thank you for staying with us till the end. Tune in every day for a live streaming on LinkedIn or check out recordings on YouTube. Share with us the topics you would like us to cover. Until next time, stay tuned.